Chapter 7's emphasis is cost behavior. Now, you've seen us talk about in previous chapters the flexible and your static or your inflexible budgets. But the way costs change or stabilize over time makes a big difference in what we've budgeted and what we actually see. So when we look at cost behavior, cost behavior is extremely important because the leader needs to know what the expectation is in terms of expenses for a given period. So it helps the leader to develop budgets, flexible budgets, because as we've seen in previous chapters, a static budget does not change. So regardless of how costs move, whatever is budgeted would not affect the extra or the discretionary spending for a particular company. It helps the leader conduct break-even analysis and contribution margin analysis, because you know that as costs move, we know that as variable costs, correct? So since it's variable costs, that would directly contribute to our ability to conduct those types of analysis. And it helps you to evaluate individual units' performance and make short-term decisions. Right? And that's made an emphasis on short-term and not long-term decisions, because if you had in order to make long-term decisions, you would have to have a stability of costs. But we know costs move during given periods, so that wouldn't be applicable here. So let's look at some common cost behaviors: fixed costs, variable costs, and mixed costs, or also known as semi-variable costs. Variable costs. We've seen variable costs in previous chapters. Variable costs change as your level of activity changes. When production is up, then your cost is up. When production is down, then your variable cost is decreased. When your variable costs remain stable, when we don't see change up or down, is because your budgeted amount that you've planned was accurate. So just some examples of variable costs: supplies. As more supplies are used and replenished, then of course your variable costs are significantly increased. As fuel is consumed, then your variable cost is increased. As a salesperson sells more and makes more for the company, then of course his income is going to increase, which would mean that the expense to the company will increase as well. Now, they're fixed costs, and the fixed cost is exactly what it says. They're fixed. These are costs that are stable over a long period of time, i.e. rent, insurance, advertising. Now that can be advertising can be an example of a variable cost, a fixed cost, or semi-variable. It just depends on how the particular company orchestrates it. Typically, taxes are fixed because they're fixed at a certain percentage. Of course, as the taxes rate changes over time, then of course that percentage may change, and then that amount may increase or decrease. But most it's very stable. Salaries, unless you are commission based, as we just mentioned, or there's some type of variance for overtime, etc. But a salaried employee makes a certain amount regardless of activity. And depreciation. There's something called straight line depreciation, which we'll go in a little bit in later chapters, but won't go into too much depth. Then there's mixed costs or semi-variable costs. Now these costs contain an element of both the mixed and but of the fixed and the variable costs. So it contains a little bit of both. So for example, a salesperson's compensation. They may have a salary that they're paid, but in addition to that, they're paid a commission as well. Your cell phone bill, you just look at it, you'll see that may change. You may have a certain rate, but depending on what you downloaded, how many text messages you sent, if you have a long distance plan or not, if you have even in minutes, etc., whatever, that can change as well. So I've used 3 different types of companies. You see a desk manufacturer, a department store, and a service company. And I want you to take a look at the costing changes and the costing basis that each of these companies incur. And so you can get an idea of some tangible examples on where they will be applicable. Now, fixed versus flexible budgets. Fixed budgets are becoming dinosaurs. You see them less and less in business because they are not as practical as they once were. And you see the first bullet that I've given you is best used when activities are stable. Now, in our current economy and what we can even foresee, activities are usually not stable in very, very few industries. Even the industries that we would think would be stable, i.e. teaching, then that's not even stable these days. So the fixed budget does not allow changes to happen when unexpected variables are in place and they change. If they have as a budget that's set for a particular period, and that budget that's set cannot be changed until that period is over with. And so that's just not very practical these days. Now, flexible budgets are what most organizations use. They allow for budget allowances. So if a business is really booming and doing extremely well during a particular period of time, and they want to take advantage of something and want to increase marketing and increase a presence in a particular area, then a flexible budget will allow them to do that. It'll allow them to pull money from one particular area to invest here. It'll allow them to take funds in and reinvest those funds for different activities. Flexible budgets allows money to be moved and transferred between departments. So flexible budgets are most commonly used in most organizations. Now, as a wrap up, here are the things that I want you to take from this particular chapter. You want to understand how cost behaves, how it moves, what happens when costs increase for a particular company, and then what happens when it decreases. What does that mean for that particular costing item? I want you to know and understand what the 3 types of cost are: fixed, variable, and semi-variable. Understand that the fixed budgets are inflexible, and then flexible budgets adjust to levels of activities. So those kind of takeaways from Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is about evaluating performance, and it's the use of what the text is going to term as variance analysis. Now, in order to understand variance analysis, you have to understand standards. There's a tool used for planning called a standard cost. Standard cost looks at each unit in a particular company as its own standalone cost and not in bulk. Now, in contrast, there is something that's termed budgeting costs. Budgeted cost looks at a block of a particular activity, and I'll give you an example in just a second, and takes those costs for that block and put those costs into a budget. For example, if I was producing hats, and as a standard cost, the standard cost would say that each hat is worth $5 or costs $5, and we sell each unit of hats for a particular amount, $10. So that is the cost, and then that's the sales price for that particular item. A budgeting cost would say that we are projecting to have 100 caps. So we will put in that budget 100, and we will put the number of 500 as a budgeting item for those block of caps, instead of looking at each cap as an individual unit. Now, there are different types of standards. Now, there's your basic standard, ideal, attainable, and expected standard. And these definitions of standards are just describing how this cost item is achieved. So for a basic standard uses previous year's data, historical data, to determine expected cost for a future period. Ideal standards assumes ideal conditions and efficiency, and it bases the cost or the expected cost based on that standard, which, as you see, basically it mostly always results in an unfavorable variance. So it's not very realistic. An attainable standard recognizes that there may be some operational efficiencies, whether that's personnel or whether that's machinery or whether that's the market, and bases a cost standard based on those particular items or those particular factors. And then there's the expected standard. These are based on current conditions and what's happening at the present. And because of that, it probably comes most closely to actual. So the expected standard is the most commonly used standard because it helps productivity and it helps projections. Your costing method used allows you to evaluate performance. You can see how far you were from expectation based on what standards you used and what your actual results were. Now, when you look at cost variance analysis, what cost variance analysis says is that we want to look at the difference between expected and actual, and based on those differences, we can determine where we are most efficient, where we're most effective, where we're most productive, and if there's any waste in the entire process that we've put together. It helps leaders make decisions about the next aspect of business. Now, the advantage of using the standard cost, of course, is that it helps the leader to evaluate performance, helps employees to understand cost awareness so you can see what each unit represents, helps motivate employees. Sometimes I think that's true and sometimes it may not be. And it may help highlight problem areas very specifically and not by bulk. Of course, it can assist in forecasting, and it can establish bids on certain types of contracts. Of course, that depends on what type of business you're in. Now, there's types of variances, and you'll see here so many types of variance: sales variance, material variance, labor variance, your overhead variance. Variances simply means your difference from expected to actual. As a wrap up of Chapter 8, your standard cost is the cost of a single unit. Budgeted is the cost of a bulk of units at the standard. And the leader should be able to investigate variances and determine what action is necessary. And it's the responsibility for your leader to look at variance across the board to make sure that the company is not being wasteful. And variance analysis should be in dollars and percentages so that you can see this impacts this. We've missed our sales amount by this many dollars, which is also equivalent to this loss of percentage. Or we exceeded budget by this many dollars, which is an increase of this percentage. Chapter 7 and 8.